Welcome everyone to ChessLecture.com. My name is International Master Bill Paschall. It's my pleasure to bring you a chess video presentation entitled Capablanca in the Endgame, Part 1. So today's featured game in this lecture is really a classic. It's an absolute classic. I'm not going to tell you everything in the first moment as to why it's a classic, because that would kind of give away some of the moves. But what you might notice from the board position, we of course have an even material endgame. Capablanca playing white, Tartakower playing black. The famous grandmaster and chess author, Savielly Tartakower, playing black, and not a slouch as one of the top players in the world. Tartakower was always overshadowed by players like Alekhine and Capablanca, but he was a great player in his own right. So we see Capablanca playing white here. He has some good things, he has some bad things in his position. What we ought to do before we look at specific moves, anytime you evaluate a position, you have to look at the kind of static features that are involved in the position. I mean long-term features. So what's good about white's position, what's good about black's position, vice versa, what's bad? Okay, white has a pretty strong king on the 3rd rank compared to black's king on the 8th rank. I'm going to highlight them both. Slightly better king. Problem, though, that makes black's king even worse is the white rook on the 7th rank. This is like a catchphrase. White rook on the 7th. We call this rook on the 7th, I don't know, there's various phrases about it, but it's basically often winning the game in its own right. Everything else equal, sometimes a rook on the 7th is enough to win if the enemy king is pinned down on the 8th rank. It's a huge advantage. Basically, white is like playing with an extra king. He also has another nice advantage here. Just give yourself, I don't know, 15 seconds to answer this question. What is white's other great static advantage in this position? It's a protected passed pawn on the 5th rank. So this passed pawn on the G file, you might have heard this terminology in another one of our ChessLecture.com presentations, protected passed pawn. So it's not only a passed pawn, that means a pawn unobstructed without possible capture ever by future enemy pawns in the distance, not only passed but protected by the pawn at f4 by another pawn at f4. So this kind of pawn is like money in the bank, basically. And I think our beginners out there will really appreciate that analogy. This protected passed pawn is very strong. What you do want to be careful about, though, is advancing this pawn. I'm increasing the arrow there a little further. Advancing this protected passed pawn too early, because that pawn adjacent to the pawn on f4 that protects it, new arrow there, it's anchoring it. And the minute you push the protected passed pawn forward, it's no longer a protected passed pawn, and it's more vulnerable. So you want to keep it attached to its anchor as long as you're sure you're not ready to go forward. Okay, so we got two advantages. Capablanca rook on the 7th, and the protected passed pawn on g5. Problems. We have some problems. Pawn on c3 is backward, and it's also attacked by an enemy rook, and there's no way to protect it. So, you know, if you look at this position with a casual glance, from a materialistic standpoint, I couldn't criticize you if your first judgment said that black was even maybe better, because he's going to win a pawn. I mean, no way around it. Black is about to win a pawn with check at that, with check on c3, and there's no way to protect the pawn. And the beauty of black's rook itself on c6 is that it's guarding, and this is the last arrow before, you know, this turns into John Madden. The last arrow indicating that the rook is protecting the pawn behind it. So it's the ultimate rook in a way. It's defending and attacking. And I said in other ChessLecture.com video presentations that the most valuable move or piece that you can have is one that defends and attacks simultaneously. So that's what this rook on c6 is doing, and it's the heart and soul of black's defense here. So white to move, though. What do you do? Well, it's not an easy question. See, the problem is when this rook comes down to c3, it's going to be with check, and the pawn at f5 opposite the white king, 2 squares in front of the white king, is controlling g4 and e4, the squares the white king might move forward to if it had to move. So the f5 pawn is very unpleasant for white. It's taking away these great squares that the king would like to go forward. So white's next move is maybe partly forced, but also the beginning of a brilliant plan. King g3. I guess you can't call it too brilliant because the process of elimination might find this move, but it's pretty deep because it actually involves not only the sacrifice of one pawn, but the sacrifice of 2 pawns. So you're losing the c3 pawn, and you're going to lose the f4 pawn too. So watch the following sequence. White gives up the 2 pawns to improve the position of his king. So king g3, rook takes c3 check, king h4. This had to be very carefully calculated, extremely carefully calculated. Look at the position of the white rook and the white king. If the black rook comes down to c1 and then across, you're in trouble. You're in danger of skewers with these checks from behind. So he had to be careful about that. The point is, if black plays something like rook c1 here, this didn't happen in the game, but let's just take a brief look. Rook c1, white plays king h5. And if rook h1 check, king g6, rook takes h7, king takes h7, and the king just happens to be in the perfect position to escort this pawn to its queening square on g8 without stop. So it wins by force if black trades rooks in that way. You may say, well, that's exactly, the way it was meant to be, but he had to calculate carefully before he went into this. So rook takes c3 check, king h4. Now black has to make the best out of a bad situation. He is, however, up material, even potentially a second pawn, and this is what happened. Rook f3. Now a key moment. A lot of people would have played maybe king h5 here, which is not so bad a move in its own right, but it's too slow. King h5 kind of loses a little bit of time. It's better now is the moment to play g6. This is what Capablanca played. g6, giving up the second pawn to create a perfect path for his king. In 2 moves, the white king can be on f6, where it's in a perfect position for 2 reasons. Obviously, he's threatening mate on the back rank with his own rook. But the reason that this f6 square is so good is because black has a pawn on f5. I've seen nightmare endgames where this kind of thing happens, where, even the side that's up material is lost because his own pawn exists on f5. In this fact, the fact of the matter is, if black didn't have that f5 pawn, he would have some real drawing chances here. Because the f5 pawn exists, white is shielded by black's own pawn from the rear. So black has nothing better. Rook takes f4 check, winning another pawn, king g5. Now what should you play? Well, it's tempting to take another pawn here. Problem is, rook takes f4 check, king g5. If you take another pawn, i.e. rook takes d4, question mark, king f6, threatening mate on h8, what can black do? He has to play after king f6, king g8. Now white simply threatens mate on the back rank. Not rook takes c7, allowing black the miracle defense rook c4. Maybe white is still better there, but it's already, lost a little bit of its edge. Rook d7, an unstoppable mate on d8. Another lesson for those of you that are a little bit too materialistic, always grabbing that pawn. The object of the game is mate, not who takes the most material to the grave with him. So Rook d7 would win easily there. Rook takes d4 doesn't work. It's too greedy, and it doesn't defend the back row. And this is really the issue here. Black needs to play a move that allows his rook access to come back to the 8th rank to defend against mates. Thus, rook e4 is the only move. Anyway, black is in grave danger. King f6, threatening mate on h8. Now what can you do? You have to play the same kind of thing. King g8. Now white's going to move the rook at some point and threaten mate, and black is going to have to come back with the rook to e8. Here's the point when I want to stress accuracy and subtlety in the endgame. You know, most people would just routinely chop off the c7 pawn here. He plays a more accurate move in some sense. Rook g7 check. You might say, well, what does that do? What does rook g7 check do? Well, you know, in the end, I think it's going to be a valuable move because it's for free. It doesn't lose anything. It's a free move, basically. And either way the black king goes to f8 or h8, we have sometimes a useful check when the pawn comes forward. So in any case, this move in no way could ever be a waste for white, and can only be a benefit, that the pawn might come forward with check, or that we might drive the king further to the side of the board. So I think this is an absolute benefit and a good intermezzo, or in-between move for Capablanca. Very accurate. Now king h8, played by Tartakower. Now rook takes pawn on c7. Look at the beautiful position of the white king. The white rook remaining on the 7th, the black king remaining pinned down on the 8th rank. White still down a pawn, but it doesn't matter because his pawn is so strong on g6, it's weaving a mating net for black. In the meantime, black's going to have to defend absolutely 100% passively by coming back, and the black pawns just start dropping. Rook e8, and now we can just start grabbing pawns. King takes f5, number 1. So now it's even material, but the black pawns are like defenseless, and still the black king is very uncomfortable on the back rank. There's very little that black can do here. After king takes f5, black playing this move rook e4, which doesn't really change anything. We can simply force him back. So this is a little bit like what happened. King f6, and now black could play back to e8 with his rook, but instead he played rook f4 check. Well, this is also bad because it forces the white king to a position where it attacks the d pawn. This is of no benefit to black, although black was hard-pressed to come up with a good move. Rook f4 check, king e5, rook g4, and this is what I said about protected passed pawns once they're no longer protected. It's no longer quite the strong pawn that it was. But here we learn an important skill in playing endgames, in evaluating endgames, knowing when you can transpose from one kind of endgame to another kind of endgame. If you saw my lecture, one of my lectures on the Rubinstein endgames, you would see the way that Rubinstein would patiently transfer the game from one kind of endgame, good knight versus bad bishop, to another kind of endgame, good rook endgame with good rook position and good king, to another kind of endgame, good king and pawn endgame with good king. So it's a subtle transitioning from one kind of endgame to the next. And that's exactly what Rubinstein and now Capablanca is doing. He sees the immediate transposition to the most fundamental of endgames, the king and pawn endgame. After rook g4, g7 check, the sad reality for black. He can't take the pawn because the king and pawn endgame is lost. If rook takes g7, rook takes g7, king takes g7, king takes d5, black has too many problems. It's almost impossible to stop the d pawn as it is with the white king in such a dominant position in front of it. And secondly, the white king is also threatening to just walk in and take the other pawns. So even if black can get to the D pawn, in the meantime he's going to lose his A and his B pawns, and the white A pawn will queen. So without even having to show you how this endgame would break down, you can just see in general principles how it would break down without me showing you the moves. Even if the black king can get at the D pawn, in the meantime, the white king would get at the A and the B pawns, and also be in a good position to escort the A pawn home. So king and pawn game is just lost here for black. So sadly he played on, although actually, if you can't take the pawn, you're in even a worse spot in a way. You're just losing all your pawns, and you can't even activate your own position by taking the enemy's material. King G8, and now rook takes A7. So that one's gone. The B6 pawn and the D5 pawns are weak, and black can't even take the one pawn that's in capture. So the game is effectively over. Rook takes A7, and then some spite moves, you might call it. Rook G1, king takes D5. So now we're 2 pawns up. Comfortable win. Though a nice little try, rook C1, cutting the white king off. This is a good practical decision. Sometimes cut the enemy king off. It's not really going to make a difference here. White has too much going for it. King D6, rook C2, and now D5, rook C1, black just waiting, rook C7, and finally, a few more moves and black gives up, rook A1, going after that loose pawn, king C6, rook takes A4, and not even grabbing the pawn, but again going with a more critical idea, which is creating a queen, so D6, and there's just no way he's going to stop this promotion without giving up at least a full rook, with the king and the rook so close, and the other pawn so powerful on G7, tying the black king down. A fabulous lesson in king position in the endgame by former world champion Jose Raul Capablanca. Thank you for joining me for part 1 of Capablanca in the endgame. This is International Master Bill Paschall signing off from ChessLecture.com.